Short, lame, epileptic, senile, and completely bald before 35. Always on the verge of death, but repeatedly baffling Christendom by continuing to live. That's not a Reddit comment. That's not some cruel TikTok caption. That's how historians Will and Ariel Durant summarized Charles II of Spain in their 1963 work, drawing on centuries of diplomatic reports, court observations, and the horrified accounts of everyone who encountered him. The Durants were synthesizing what ambassadors, papal nuncios, and foreign dignitaries had been writing home about for decades. The language they used, devastating, clinical, almost pitying, captured exactly what contemporaries thought when they looked at the most powerful monarch in Europe and saw a man who seemed to be dying in slow motion. And here's the thing nobody talks about. Every documentary you've ever seen about Charles II tells you the same story. Inbreeding, bad. Look at this sick king. His jaw was weird. The end. But that's not the interesting question, is it? The interesting question, the one that kept European diplomats sending confused dispatches to their capitals for nearly 4 decades, is this. How did he not die at 5? Because Charles II shouldn't have survived infancy. He shouldn't have learned to walk. He definitely shouldn't have made it to his 39th birthday. Yet he did. For 38 years, this man, who diplomatic reports described as barely functional, kept waking up every morning while healthier men dropped dead around him. France prepared for his succession. Austria prepared. The Pope prepared. Everyone prepared. And Charles just kept not dying. That's the story we're actually telling today. Not another genealogy lecture. Not another "look how deformed he was" slideshow. We're playing medical detective on the most improbable survival story in royal history. Let's start with the family tree, because I know viewers who've watched other videos about this came away more confused than when they started. People consistently ask variations of, "I still don't get how his grandmother was also his aunt." So, here it is. Once, simply, then we move on. Charles II's father was Philip IV of Spain. His mother was Mariana of Austria. Now pay attention, because this is where it gets properly twisted. Mariana wasn't some distant princess from a faraway kingdom. She was Philip IV's niece, the daughter of Philip's own sister, Maria Anna of Spain, which means Charles II's mother was simultaneously his first cousin once removed. But wait, there's more. Mariana had originally been engaged to marry Balthazar Charles, Philip IV's son from his first marriage. She was supposed to be Charles II's sister-in-law. When Balthazar Charles died in 1646, did the Habsburgs find Mariana a new husband from a different family? Did they think maybe, just maybe, some fresh genetic material might be nice? No. They moved her one generation up. She married her dead fiancé's father instead. If you tried to draw Charles II's family tree, you wouldn't get the normal spreading branches that genealogy software expects. You'd get something that looks like a pretzel, or a failed Celtic knot drawn by someone who gave up halfway through. By the time Charles was conceived, he had only 32 distinct ancestors in his 5-generation family tree, when he should have had 62. Nearly half his potential genetic diversity simply didn't exist because the same people occupied multiple positions in his ancestry. If Charles II took a 23andMe test today, the algorithm would probably just crash. Or display a single error message. We need to talk. That's all you need to know about the family tree. One visual, one explanation. Moving on. November 6, 1661. The Royal Alcazar of Madrid. Charles enters the world, and from his first breath, he's already defying expectations. His father, Philip IV, is 56 years old, and has already buried most of his children. Infant mortality in the Spanish Habsburg line wasn't just high, it was catastrophic. Brothers and sisters of Charles had died from fevers, from mysterious ailments, from the simple biological reality that their bodies couldn't sustain themselves. Charles was described at birth as weak, sickly, and unlikely to live long enough to walk. He didn't walk until he was 8 years old. 8. Most kids are running, climbing trees, driving their parents insane by age 8. Charles was taking his first steps, and when he finally did walk, his gait was unsteady, described by observers as lurching rather than striding. He was nursed until nearly the same age, weaned embarrassingly late even by the generous standards of royal childhood, because his jaw made the transition to solid food nearly impossible. Philip IV died in 1665, making Charles king at 3 years old. His mother Mariana became regent, governing Spain on behalf of a child king so fragile that foreign courts began immediately positioning for the succession. Every major power in Europe assumed Charles would die young. France's Louis XIV had married Charles's half-sister Maria Theresa and had his eyes firmly on the Spanish throne. Diplomats were dispatched. Alliances were formed, treaties were drafted, all predicated on the assumption that this sickly boy would be dead within a few years. But Charles kept not dying. Here's an uncomfortable comparison worth making. While Charles II sat on the most powerful throne in Europe, barely able to feed himself, Spanish peasants were living completely different biological lives. A farmer in Castile in 1670 might have been poor, illiterate, working back-breaking hours in fields he didn't own. But that farmer had something Charles would never possess: a functional gene pool. Peasant families married outside their villages. They brought in genetic diversity from neighboring towns, from travelers, from anyone who wasn't their cousin. Their children died too. Infant mortality was brutal across all classes. But when peasant children survived, they could chew their food. They could walk by age 2. They could speak clearly. They could, eventually, have children of their own. The irony is almost too perfect. The Spanish nobility looked down on peasants as inferior, dirty, common, unworthy of mixing bloodlines with. Yet peasant families were producing healthier, more capable human beings than the royal house that claimed divine right to rule over them. A peasant mother watching her child take first steps at 18 months had no idea that in the royal palace, a king existed who couldn't do the same until age 8. She didn't know that the ruler who taxed her family's meager harvest couldn't chew bread without assistance. She couldn't have imagined that the most powerful man in Spain drooled constantly, spoke incomprehensibly, and would leave no heir because his reproductive organs never properly developed. The royals never wondered why they were uglier than peasants, never questioned why commoner families thrived while Habsburg children kept dying. The answer was obvious to anyone willing to see it: fresh blood versus recycled blood. Diversity versus purity. Biology doesn't care about your crown. Mariana's regency was supposed to be temporary, a placeholder until Charles came of age and could rule on his own. But what does coming of age mean for a king who could barely feed himself? The Queen Regent faced an impossible situation, maintaining control of a vast empire while pretending her son would eventually be capable of governing it. She surrounded herself with favorites, most notably Fernando de Valenzuela, a minor noble who rose to become the effective ruler of Spain through his influence over the Queen Mother. The arrangement worked, sort of, as long as no one looked too closely at the boy king. But someone was looking closely. Don Juan José of Austria, Philip IV's illegitimate son, Charles's half-brother, had been shut out of power by Mariana and her favorites. He was everything Charles wasn't: healthy, capable, charismatic, a proven military commander. And he spent years building support among the Spanish nobility, who grew increasingly frustrated watching a sick child nominally rule while a queen regent's favorites actually ran things. In 1677, Don Juan José finally made his move. He marched on Madrid with an army, forced Mariana into exile, had Valenzuela arrested and shipped off to the Philippines, and took control of the government himself. For 2 years, he essentially ran Spain while Charles sat on the throne looking confused and unwell. The half-brother who should have been king in everything but name. The healthy Habsburg, the one who worked. And then Don Juan José died in 1679, just like that. Probably from illness, though poison rumors circulated, as they always did in the Spanish court. The capable brother gone. The incapable king still somehow alive. The pattern that would define Charles's entire reign. Everyone around him dying while he inexplicably persisted. Through childhood illnesses that killed his predecessors, through the measles that swept through royal households, through fevers and fits and mysterious ailments that 17th century medicine could neither diagnose nor treat. Charles somehow persisted. Each year he survived was another year the European powers had to wait. Another year their succession plans had to remain in holding patterns. Another year of reports from Madrid saying essentially, "We thought he'd be dead by now, but he's still here, and we don't understand it either." So what did people actually see when they looked at Charles II? Because the written descriptions are brutal, and they come not from modern historians making cruel assessments, but from the people who encountered him in person. The Habsburg jaw. You've probably seen it referenced, but let me be specific about what this actually meant for Charles's daily life. His lower jaw protruded so far forward that his upper and lower teeth could not meet. At all. Chewing food was nearly impossible. Ambassadors reported that meals had to be specially prepared, essentially pre-digested, because the King of Spain could not perform the basic human function of biting and grinding his food. Eating was laborious, undignified, a spectacle that visiting dignitaries found difficult to reconcile with the ornate grandeur of the Spanish court. He drooled constantly, couldn't control it. The saliva accumulated due to his oral malformation, and there was simply nothing to be done. His tongue was reportedly so large for his mouth that it further impeded both his speech and his eating. When Charles spoke, people struggled to understand him. Court attendants learned to interpret his limited verbal clarity. Foreign diplomats, accustomed to the carefully maintained dignity of royal courts, were shocked by these intimate details that no amount of ceremonial robes could hide. The disparity between what a king was supposed to be and what Charles actually was created a kind of cognitive dissonance that echoes through every contemporary account. Here was the most powerful throne in Europe, occupied by a man who couldn't chew his dinner. His physical development was severely stunted. Beyond the late walking, Charles was thin, weak, possessing what observers called a constitution so fragile that any minor illness sent the court into preparations for succession. He suffered fits consistent with epilepsy, episodes that terrified his attendants, and led to a peculiar dual approach to his medical care. They called him Carlos el Hechizado, Charles the Bewitched. Not as a cruel nickname, as an official diagnosis. By the 1690s, with Charles still childless despite 2 marriages and his health deteriorating visibly, the Spanish court concluded that natural medicine had failed. The only remaining explanation? Witchcraft. Someone had cursed the king. Someone had made him impotent through dark magic, and the only solution was to fight magic with religion. Enter Fray Antonio Alvarez de Argüelles, an Asturian monk who claimed special expertise in demonic possession. In 1699, With Charles clearly dying by degrees, the court authorized a series of exorcisms that would be farcical if they weren't so desperate. The exorcism sessions weren't brief prayers over a sick man. They were extensive, theatrical productions that went on for hours at a time, sometimes daily, for months. Fray Antonio would enter the king's chambers with holy water, crucifixes, and the absolute certainty that demons were responsible for Charles's condition. He performed the rituals in Latin, demanding that the evil spirits reveal themselves. He interrogated the demons directly, asking them their names, how long they had possessed the king, and who had sent them. The demons, conveniently, answered. Through the mouths of supposed intermediaries, women who claimed to be possessed themselves and could translate the demons' responses, Fray Antonio extracted a detailed confession. The spirits supposedly revealed that Charles had been cursed at age 14. The curse had been administered through a cup of chocolate. Specific ingredients had been mixed into the drink: dissolved human remains, parts of the brain, intestines, and kidneys of an executed criminal. The demons named the woman who had prepared the cursed beverage on behalf of unnamed enemies at court. This wasn't a quiet investigation. The accusations threatened to tear the court apart. If someone had truly cursed the king through black magic, that person was guilty of treason against the crown and heresy against God. The Holy Inquisition could get involved. Heads could roll. And Fray Antonio kept pushing for names, for specifics, for someone to blame for Charles's condition. The treatments administered alongside the exorcisms were equally medieval. Charles was given potions containing oil blessed by multiple saints, mixed with herbs believed to counteract demonic influence. He was made to drink concoctions that included ground-up remains of previous Spanish royalty, the logic being that the holy blood of his ancestors might strengthen him against the curse. When those didn't work, the recipes became more exotic. Animal parts, compounds designed to purge evil through violent physical reactions. Ingredients that would make a modern pharmacologist weep. Charles, by most accounts, participated willingly. He was a devout man, genuinely religious, not merely performing piety for political reasons. If demons were the cause of his suffering, then God could surely cast them out. The exorcisms gave him something medicine never had: hope. False hope, obviously, but hope nonetheless. The sessions continued for nearly a year. They accomplished nothing except further weakening an already dying man, terrifying the court with accusations of demonic conspiracy, and providing future historians with evidence of just how far 17th century Spain had fallen from its golden age. The demons were never successfully exorcised. The curse was never lifted. Charles remained impotent, sick, and dying. Because the demons weren't real. The curse wasn't real. The only thing that was real was 2 centuries of genetic damage that no amount of holy water could wash away. So here's the core question, the one that separates this video from every other Charles II documentary. Everyone else tells you how sick he was. The real mystery is how he survived 38 years when every biological indicator suggested he should have died in childhood. Several factors worked in his favor despite his catastrophic genetic inheritance. First, and this is almost paradoxical, being royal may have actually helped. Charles had access to the best medical care available in the 17th century. Now, I know what you're thinking. 17th century medicine was garbage, bloodletting, leeches, treatments that probably caused more harm than good. And you're right. But Charles had something invaluable that no peasant child with similar conditions would have enjoyed. People whose entire job was keeping him alive. When Charles developed an illness, resources were immediately mobilized. When his condition worsened, specialists were summoned from across Europe. The institutional will to preserve the king not out of love necessarily, but out of political necessity, created a support system that the average person with his conditions simply would not have had. Someone was always watching. Someone was always ready to respond. The Spanish court essentially put Charles in a 38-year-long medically supervised holding pattern. Second, Charles seems to have experienced periods of relatively better health between crises. His condition wasn't a steady decline, but a fluctuating series of illnesses and recoveries. This suggests that while his genetic inheritance left him vulnerable to practically everything, none of his conditions were immediately fatal in the way that some mutations affecting his deceased siblings had been. Charles may have simply been lucky in the particular roll of the genetic dice, less sick than he could have been, even if far sicker than anyone should have been. His inbreeding coefficient has been calculated at approximately 0.254. For context, that's higher than what you'd expect from a child whose parents were siblings. Brother-sister offspring typically have a coefficient around 0.25. Charles exceeded that. But the specific combination of genetic problems he inherited happened to be survivable. Barely. A body with a damaged transmission, failing brakes, a cracked windshield, and an engine that burned oil, but capable of limping along far longer than anyone predicted. Third, Charles was protected from the dangers that killed many in his era. He didn't go to war. He didn't travel extensively. He was kept in controlled environments where his exposure to infectious diseases was minimized. The Spanish court wrapped him in protective custody from birth, not because they valued him as a person, but because they needed him as a symbol. Without Charles, the Spanish Habsburg line ended, and with it, all the political power that everyone at court depended upon. Keeping Charles alive was an institutional priority. And institutions, when properly motivated, can be remarkably effective. But here's what the survival statistics don't capture. Charles knew. He understood what he was, what he wasn't, what he could never be. All jokes aside, imagine how painful the mere task of existing was for a man whose body betrayed him in every conceivable way. Who watched his wives' hopes turn to despair, who heard the whispers about succession, about who would claim his throne the moment he stopped breathing, who understood that everything his family had built would be contested the instant he died. Charles's 2 marriages were disasters of expectation and disappointment. His first wife, Marie-Louise of Orléans, arrived at the Spanish court in 1679. As a vibrant French princess. By several accounts, Charles genuinely loved her. She was young, attractive, brought energy to the gloomy Spanish court. But their marriage produced no children. Marie-Louise died in 1689 at just 26, possibly from appendicitis, though poisoning rumors circulated. Charles was reportedly devastated. Contemporary accounts describe him weeping at her bedside, a rare glimpse of genuine emotion from a man usually discussed only in terms of his medical conditions. His second marriage to Maria Anna of Neuburg in 1689 was purely political, a last desperate attempt to produce an heir. Maria Anna came from a fertile family. Her mother had borne 23 children, but no amount of genetic screening of the queen could compensate for the king's physical incapacity. The marriage remained childless. As Charles's health declined through the 1690s, the couple's relationship deteriorated into mutual resentment and political scheming. Maria Anna, frustrated by her inability to produce an heir, became a controversial figure at court. Charles retreated further into illness and melancholy. In his final years, Charles made statements that have echoed through historical accounts. Variations of a devastating self-assessment. I am nothing. Think about that. The King of Spain, ruler of an empire that spanned continents, possessing nominal authority over millions of people, and his own evaluation of his worth, his contribution, his existence. Nothing. He knew he was considered a failure. He knew his dynasty would end with him. He carried that weight alongside every other burden his body forced him to bear. Charles II wasn't oblivious to his situation. That might have been a mercy. Instead, he was aware, conscious of his inadequacy, watching himself fail in slow motion for 38 years. The tragedy isn't that he suffered. Suffering was universal in the 17th century. The tragedy is that he suffered uselessly, a sacrifice to a system that had created him precisely so he could perpetuate it, only to find that the same system had made him incapable of doing so. As Charles's death approached in 1700, his bedchamber became a battleground, not for his soul, but for his signature. The French ambassador, Henri de Massue, Marquis d'Harcourt, arrived in Madrid with a single mission: ensure Philip of Anjou, Louis XIV's 17-year-old grandson, inherited the Spanish Empire. Harcourt was a skilled diplomat, and he understood that the dying king himself was almost irrelevant. Charles could barely hold a pen. The real targets were the people who would guide that pen. Harcourt worked systematically through the Spanish nobility. He hosted dinners. He made promises. He suggested, subtly, that a French prince could protect Spain from Austrian domination better than another Habsburg. France was powerful. France was nearby. France could guarantee that the Spanish Empire remained intact rather than being carved up among rival powers. The French candidate would keep Spain strong. The Austrian ambassador, Aloysius von Herrick, played defense. His candidate was Archduke Charles of Austria, another Habsburg, one who would keep the dynasty's legacy intact. Herrick argued tradition. He argued blood. He reminded Spanish nobles that the Habsburgs had ruled Spain for 2 centuries and that abandoning the family now would be a betrayal of everything their ancestors had built. Both ambassadors bribed extensively. Gold changed hands. Promises of titles, lands, and positions were made to anyone who might influence the succession. The Spanish court became a marketplace where the future of Europe was being auctioned to the highest bidder. Cardinal Portocarrero, the Archbishop of Toledo, and one of Charles's closest advisors, became the key figure. Whoever convinced Portocarrero would likely win the succession. Harcourt focused his efforts accordingly. He argued that only France could prevent Spain from becoming an Austrian vassal. He suggested that the Pope himself, who had indicated support for Philip, favored the French candidate. He painted a picture of a glorious Franco-Spanish alliance that would dominate Europe. Portocarrero was convinced, and Portocarrero had Charles's ear. In the final weeks of September and October 1700, the dying king was presented with documents to sign. Charles could barely understand what he was agreeing to. His mind, never sharp, had deteriorated alongside his body. But his signature still mattered. His will would determine whether France or Austria claimed the largest empire in the world. Queen Maria Anna, Charles's second wife, desperate to maintain her own position after his death, pushed for the Austrian candidate. She had her own meetings, her own arguments, her own attempts to sway her husband in his final days. The royal bedchamber became a stage where ambassadors, cardinals, and queens performed for an audience of one dying man who could barely follow the dialogue. In October 1700, Charles signed his final testament. He named Philip of Anjou, the French candidate, as his heir. The Austrian Habsburgs were cut out. After 2 centuries of Spanish Habsburg rule, the crown would pass to a Bourbon. Why did Charles choose France? The French diplomatic effort had been masterful, certainly. Portocarrero's influence was decisive. The Pope's tacit support mattered. But perhaps there was something else. Perhaps Charles, in whatever clarity remained to him, wanted to spite the family whose marriage policies had made him what he was. The Habsburgs had created him, had used him, had reduced him to a symbol of dynastic continuity, while ignoring that he was also a human being suffering through every single day. Maybe naming a bourbon was his final act of rebellion against a system that had destroyed him. We'll never know what Charles actually thought in those final weeks. His mind was too far gone. His body was failing. The signatures he produced were guided by hands that weren't his own. November 1st, 1700. Just 5 days before what would have been his 39th birthday. Charles II finally died. And then they opened him up. The autopsy that followed produced findings so disturbing that even 17th century physicians, men accustomed to death and decay, were shocked by what they discovered. The report has survived in various accounts, and the details are worth knowing because they represent the biological receipt for 2 centuries of Habsburg marriage policy. Charles's heart was described as the size of a peppercorn, whether literally accurate or a physician's way of expressing severe atrophy. The message was clear. The organ responsible for pumping blood through his body was catastrophically underdeveloped. This man had functioned for 38 years with a heart that could barely sustain life. His lungs were described as corroded. Chronic respiratory infections, some underlying pulmonary condition, damage accumulated over decades of illness. The exact cause isn't clear, but the result was obvious. His respiratory system was failing long before his final breath. His intestines were gangrenous, rotted, which would have made nutrition absorption nearly impossible and likely contributed to his lifelong weakness and stunted development. His body couldn't properly process the food he could barely chew in the first place. And perhaps most notably, Charles's body contained only a single shriveled testicle. There it was, the anatomical explanation for his inability to produce an heir despite 2 marriages. Both Marie-Louise of Orleans and Maria Anna of Neuburg had been blamed, at various points, for the couple's childlessness. Foreign courts had speculated, physicians had theorized. Everyone had opinions about why the king couldn't father a child. The autopsy made it obvious. Charles had never been physically capable of producing an heir. The biological infrastructure simply wasn't there. Every exorcism, every fertility treatment, every desperate prayer, all of it had been pointless from the start. The physicians who performed the autopsy expressed amazement that Charles had been alive at all, let alone that he had survived to nearly 40. One account records their conclusion in stark terms. They could not understand how such a body could have sustained life for even a single day, much less decades. Charles's death triggered exactly what everyone feared, the War of the Spanish Succession. From 1701 to 1714, Europe tore itself apart fighting over the inheritance of a man who had never been capable of leaving one. France and Spain allied against Austria, England, the Dutch Republic, and various German states. Hundreds of thousands died. The map of Europe was redrawn, and all of it, all the blood, all the treaties, all the suffering, flowed from the simple fact that the Habsburgs had valued dynastic purity over functional genetics. The Habsburgs spent 2 centuries marrying each other to keep their bloodline pure, to preserve their dynasty, to ensure that power stayed within the family, uncle to niece, cousin to cousin. The same genetic material folding back on itself generation after generation until it produced Charles II, a walking advertisement for why that's a catastrophically bad idea. But the royals never wondered why they were uglier than peasants, never questioned why their children kept dying while commoner families thrived, never made the connection between their marriage practices and the mounting evidence of biological consequences. Or maybe they did wonder. Maybe they knew. And they did it anyway. Because power was more important than healthy children. Keeping the throne in Habsburg hands mattered more than whether those hands could actually grip anything. The system perpetuated itself at the expense of the human beings trapped within it, including, ultimately, the very king it was designed to protect. Charles II baffled Christendom for 38 years, not through strength, but through the absurd determination of a body that refused to surrender to the genetic lottery it had been dealt. He was a medical impossibility who outlived every prediction, a man whose own physicians couldn't explain how he was still alive. But the villain of this story isn't Charles. It never was. The villain is the institution. The dynasty, the system that decided human beings were acceptable casualties in the pursuit of consolidated power. Charles II was a victim of his genes, of his family's policies, of a European power structure that needed him as a symbol more than it cared about him as a person. He died thinking he was nothing, but he was actually proof of something important. What happens when institutions value their own continuation over the well-being of the people they claim to serve? The Spanish Habsburgs ended with Charles II. The dynasty destroyed itself through the very marriages meant to preserve it. That's not tragedy. That's consequences. Short, lame, epileptic, senile, and completely bald before 35. Always on the verge of death, but repeatedly baffling Christendom by continuing to live. For 38 impossible years, Charles II kept waking up, kept existing, kept defying every prediction his body seemed to make about itself. And then, finally, he stopped. The real question isn't why Charles II died. The real question is how anyone thought creating him was a good idea in the first place. Subscribe for more stories like this.